Oh, Judy, this is your 4th exhibition here. Congratulations.
Thanks, Anne. Thanks for inviting me.
It's so nice after our long COVID break to open up to such a beautiful show.
Oh, thank you. I'm really thrilled that it's finally up and running.
Yes. The Silk Route, here we are again, all your travels. It's lovely, given we can't travel,
Yes,
to actually go travelling with you.
That's the thing. I haven't been able to travel for 3 years, so it's really nice to be able to travel through the work that I do, because all of this has stayed in my head since the last trip that I did on the Silk Road, so it just had to come out.
And what is it about the Silk Route?
I think it's the total change in culture, the richness of the culture, the richness of the art and the craft in the culture that I find so inspiring. It's a totally different world to the world that we experience in our everyday lives here. And I think that seeing that artefacts that are used in everyday life, craft that is used in everyday life, where we have so much more manufactured things, that is really appealing to me to see that.
You can see the artisans' work everywhere you look, be it on tiles or rugs or clothing or embroidery. It's remarkable and centuries old, isn't it?
Centuries old. And this is the intriguing thing, that you see the hand of the maker in everything. And that's what I really like. When I go away, I take literally thousands of photos. And I'm very interested in the details of things. So I take photographs of embroidery, marks, calligraphy, graffiti, tiles, anything that some person has created with their own hand. I find that really interesting.
You've got such a great eye for detail looking at some of your photographs that you've taken, where you've picked up that tiny little detail, be it a tile on a temple that's a few inches big, and then hey presto, they've turned into huge, great big art quilts.
Yeah. So what I do with the photographs, it always takes me a long time to sort through them, and I put them into various categories. But often I can remember things from looking at the detail of something. I know exactly where it is and where it's come from. So having got that resource, then I use those images as a starting point for creating the fabric. And I don't interpret those images too literally. It's just a feeling I'm trying to convey with the pieces that I make. So I might do things that look a bit like calligraphy. I might take a little a photograph, an image of a tiny little carving from a temple door, but I will adapt it and add my own design to it. So it's not a specific thing that I'm trying to replicate, it's just a feeling, the emotion of being in a particular place or about a particular colour.
And so when you take the photograph, when you're actually getting your eye in and taking that photograph, have you already started to think about how you're going to interpret that into your artwork?
Not necessarily at that point, but I think over years it's become second nature to me what it is I'm interested in photographing. And again, it really is that close-up detail. Because of the texture, because of the pattern, there's a lot of pattern, and I use a lot of pattern in my work. I'm really interested in pattern and repetitive pattern. So I just think I have an innate sense now of what it is I want to photograph, and that just gets locked away up in here. And then when I want to create a piece of work, it's usually based on something.
So, taking the quilt behind you, would you like to tell us about how you've transferred the images from the photos into this work that you've now put together in this quilt?
Well, the images here are based on, some of them are based on traditional tile patterns, and tile patterns really intrigue me, again, because of the fact that they're made by an individual, and yet over time, hundreds and thousands of tiles are made in the same pattern by different individuals, and they're all slightly different because of the mark of the hand. So on this panel on the left-hand side, this is simply drawing with textile ink, drawing quite freehand directly onto the cloth. This section here is based on another tile pattern. It has this wonderful repeating image, so you get this lovely secondary pattern occurring, and you see it a lot in China and throughout Uzbekistan. The blue and white tiles from a mausoleum called the Mausoleum of the Fragrant Concubine is one of my inspirations. And so that's sort of where this influence came from. Again, it's repeated in this design here. This is discharged. And this is, I made a block and roller printed this design here. This references the lattice work that you see in Uzbekistan, and it's again is discharged. I dyed the fabric and then discharged the fabric. This is sort of my take on calligraphy and Arabic text, very loosely applied, and it's a monoprint. So I'd simply put the ink onto a surface, drawn into the ink on the surface, and put a piece of fabric over the top and pulled it off. So it's a combination of different techniques, but also it's about the blues of Uzbekistan mainly.
Now, Judy, this is one of the quilts you talked about that was inspired by the many temples you saw in China, that beautiful red.
Yes. Chinese red is the most glorious colour. And I spent a day and a night in Xi'an some years ago, and actually write a bit of poetry, and I wrote a poem about Chinese red, all the different reds that I saw in that day and night. And that sort of influenced this quilt a little bit, even though it's about temples, it's about all the different kinds of reds that you see. The image on this section of the quilt was, again, from a tiny little carving on a door that I have taken and adapted. I never want to use things literally. I don't want to. I always have to impose my own design ethic on what I use. And this one at the top is entirely made up by me. It's just taking different images that I've seen, including the lotus flower that you see a lot in China. You see it being sold on the streets. So the techniques I've used in this quilt, this is simply drawing directly onto hand-dyed fabric using textile ink. Two drawings on different kinds of fabric that I've dyed. The section in the top left-hand corner repeats that blue and white motif we saw a little while ago. And it's a mixture of discharge, which I've done with bleach, and painting over it with textile ink and doing a little bit of stamping as well. And this section here is monoprints, and the motif is again sort of referencing a little bit of calligraphy, a little bit of graffiti. This is sort of a made-up image of, it's sort of a bit fan-like, it looks a bit Chinese, but it's not anything specific. And the top section is a mixture of bleach with discharge and some soy wax resist, as well as some stamping on the top of it. So it's a mixture of techniques. But what I was trying to do with this quilt was just get the feeling of this glorious red.
And you certainly have achieved that. It's the most glorious red.
Thank you.
Congratulations, you won an award for this piece, didn't you?
I did, yes. In 2020 I won the Finger Lakes Surface Design Award at Quilts Equals Art Equals Quilts in New York State at the Schweinfurt Art Gallery.
And that's the second one you've won there in a row, isn't it?
I won it again last year for a different quilt. Yes, I was absolutely thrilled. It's a very prestigious award to win, and I was delighted. Yeah.
It's fantastic because you've been working at your art quilts for many decades.
A long time now. I think I started making quilts in the 60s, making quilted quilts in the late 70s, so I've been going for quite a long time.
Well,
Just getting the hang of it.
you're just getting into your stride, eh? Okay. So you were travelling through the beautiful Siberian winter, weren't you?
Yes, and it was late autumn, so a lot of the trees were golden in their autumn foliage, and of course there were a lot of birch trees and a lot of forests that had lost their leaves. So there was this wonderful contrast between this sort of deep orange of the leaves falling and the starkness of the black and white birch trees and the vertical lines that they created as you're going past, this wonderful sort of imagery. So that was what was behind the feeling behind this quilt, that I wanted to get the feeling that you were passing these forests at some sort of speed. And so what I did with this quilt is that this section here is made up of different kinds of techniques. Excuse me. The top section is a monoprint, again, which painting ink onto a surface and then drawing into the surface of the ink. This second section uses that technique on a slightly different fabric. I've used different paints, and I've also done some stamping over the top of it. And the bottom section is wax resist discharge. So it sort of gives you the feeling, well, it gives me the feeling of the depth of the forest. And this section here represents the leaves as they're falling in these wonderful colours. And this is just one large monoprint that I printed off first of all with textile ink, and then I used pricing dyes to create the colour.
Judy, this is very different for you, this incredibly deep and rich and vibrant blues.
Yeah, this is Uzbekistan. The blues in Uzbekistan are just incredible. I think if I was to think about colour in terms of Uzbekistan, it would have to be blue. The tiles there, and of course through Turkey, the images of tiles will stay with me forever, I think. But it's a combination too of imagery, because not only does it represent the blues of Uzbekistan, but I've taken some of my graffiti images that I photographed in China. And this particular design here is a design that was carved into a step on a Chinese temple. But I really love this image, and I've used it a number of times. Again, it's a monoprint, and I've used prosium dyes over the top of it. This one, again, is a monoprint made with textile ink. I like the spontaneity of monoprints. I don't know what I'm going to get. I've got a basic idea what will happen, but I love that feeling of not knowing exactly what I'm going to achieve.
Yes, it's a surprise.
It's a surprise, yeah. And it's always the what if. What if I do this?
Yeah,
what
yeah.
if I do the next thing? Again, this is taken from a graffiti wall where people used it. Obviously, it's the local notice board. They put up signs and telephone numbers. Ring this number if you want to sell your goat or whatever, which I didn't understand. But it just intrigued me, the beauty of the calligraphy combined with the numbers that we can all read. And this is another loose representation of a Chinese-y sort of motif. So I've combined the colours of Uzbekistan with the sort of some imagery from China. It all sort of blends in together.
The mark making's beautiful. So for me, some of them are very small, and some of them are, as they are on the right-hand side, are large and deliberate, and they work really well together, don't they?
Yeah, I think they do. It takes a lot of. I make a lot of fabric. So with this particular quilt, I started off by, with all of the quilts, I start off by making a lot of fabric that I'm getting the feel for the colour, what it is I want to, what I intend to do, what sort of imagery patterning I want to make. And so I've got a lot of fabric, And then it's a matter of when the fabric's made, picking and choosing which ones I like together and putting them up on the design wall and moving things around until I end up with a composition that I'm happy with. And even though it's got very simple, large pieces of fabric, this compositional aspect of the quilts takes an incredibly long time. Sometimes they just go together just like that, but most of the time it's a lot of decision making that goes on, and I really like that whole process of what goes with what. And then of course they're intensively quilted. I really like to have my quilts intensively quilted, which I do. I quilt them myself. And most of these quilts have been quilted in a grid pattern which represents the degrees of latitude and longitude. So where am I in the world in terms of latitude, longitude. And again, that quilting is very time consuming, but it's also a very, it's a very reflective time too. So when I've made the work and finishing the process, and I think it's that process of quilt making that is really integral to the art as well, that's so important to me.
There's so many stages of living with it, isn't it? It's not just waking up in the morning, I'll do a bit of painting on some cloth, I'll whip it together. You've got to actually live with it, and it might be months before you get
and it's very intensive days' work. So if you're setting up for a day where you're painting, or you have to be prepared to work until you're exhausted, because the setting up and the cleaning up afterwards. So you can't do it in fits and starts. The quilting you can do in fits and starts, but the rest of it you can't. Yeah, so it's and I do enjoy that, the whole process of making the quilt.
That enjoyment shines through clearly in this show. It's just, for me, your absolute love of travelling, of getting your eye into certain things and then creating. So it's very clear that you adore it, whether it's...
I've thoroughly enjoyed making these pieces. It was just something I had to, I just had to get out. I mean, it had been on my mind since the last trip that I did, that there was more that I wanted to do, and I wanted to do them in a different way from the exhibition I had a few years ago that was based on Silk Road. So, yes, and coming back into colour, because a lot of my work has been about Dora Creek, so the colours have been pretty muted sort of colour, and I wanted to get back into expressing myself in colour again. So.
And now that you've done that and this is up and hanging, what's going on in your mind now? Where you're thinking, this interests me?
Well, I'm just working on a new piece at the moment that has taken on a life of its own, and it's a piece about a tree that I took a photograph of at Lake Arari. And I had this idea of what I could do with her. A friend was moving house. She gave me a whole lot of fabrics she no longer wanted. And I thought, I wonder if I could use these. They were hand dyes. They were old, quite old. I thought, I wonder if I can use these in some new way. And I was thinking of discharging, which I've done. And it's just taken on. It's not what I expected at all. So I don't know where it's going.
How exciting, because it might take you down a path you haven't been before.
Yeah, so at the moment I'm experimenting with things. I'm experimenting with different sorts of techniques. I'm just having a bit of a play in the studio, and at the moment I've got this piece up on the wall, which is bigger. At the moment it's bigger than this. I don't know where it's going. It might end up not going anywhere, but yeah.
We're just so incredibly lucky to have you in the world, and for you to bring such beautiful colour and joy to us all. It's so important to be able to see the work that people produce, and I feel so honoured to have you back here in the gallery after 4 times. So maybe your new discharge tree might end up here. Who knows?
But thank you for inviting me. It's been really great to spend the last couple of years working towards this show and to thinking about it and thinking how it might look in this lovely space.
and I'm really thrilled with the way it's hanging and the way the colours sort of bounce off each other.
So thank you.